He was once the only light in her world. Later, that very light pushed her into the abyss with his own hands. On the divorce agreement, Caspian Thorne had written in cold, ruthless strokes, "Approved. All assets go to the male party. The female party leaves with nothing." 3 years. Over 1,000 days and nights. Iris Valen thought she had already burned the past to ashes. Until they met again by the lakeshore in Lake Tahoe. He was still the untouchable king of the business world, surrounded by admirers. And she was standing beside another man. When Caspian finally saw who that man was, the unreachable figure at the very top of the global wealth rankings, the familiar, confident look in his eyes cracked for the first time. 01. Lake Tahoe, California. A top-tier private collector's cocktail reception was underway. Caspian held a glass of whiskey, half listening as a business partner beside him praised a limited edition Patek Philippe watch to the skies. He wore a hand-tailored charcoal gray suit, tall and straight-backed, sharp brows and deep-set eyes. Every movement carried the cool restraint of someone steeped in power and money for over a decade. He had long since grown immune to shallow flattery. His gaze swept across the room like a lion surveying its territory, searching for the real prize of the evening, the rumored masterpiece soon to appear. A one-of-a-kind ancient ceremonial textile from a lost Mesoamerican civilization. The Thorne Group's cultural foundation was determined to acquire it, but as his eyes passed one polished yet boring face after another, his gaze suddenly froze. By the floor-to-ceiling windows stood a woman with her back to him, dressed in a soft ivory silk dress with a high collar and clean, elegant lines. Her silhouette was slender and graceful. Jet black hair was pinned up with a simple wooden hairpin, exposing a pale, delicate curve of her neck. That familiar line, like a perfectly cut key, instantly pried open memories Caspian had sealed away for 3 years. He moved toward her almost on instinct. The noise around him seemed to be blocked by an invisible barrier. In his world, only that figure remained. Impossible. How could she be here? This was a gathering where even he had only secured an invitation because of his position as Asia-Pacific president of the Thorne Group. A woman he had thrown out 3 years ago, someone who couldn't even afford a plane ticket back then. How could she possibly appear in the highest social circle of Lake Tahoe? When he was only 3 steps away, the woman slowly turned sideways and handed the champagne in her hand to the man beside her. "Adrian," she said softly, yet her voice pierced Caspian's ears like an ice spike. "This starry night isn't from Van Gogh's mature period. Look at the pigment layers. They're closer to his early work in Nuenen." As she spoke, a faint, composed smile curved her lips. That focused confidence. Caspian had never seen it on her face before. 3 years apart, Iris had changed. She was no longer the woman who always wore washed-out cotton dresses, smelling of disinfectant and thread, standing before him with timid eyes and quiet eagerness to please. Her features were still delicate, but now they looked like jade refined by a master craftsman, cleansed of dust, glowing with a warm yet unbreakable strength. The ivory silk dress she wore was embroidered with intricate flowing cloud patterns in gold and silver thread. As she moved, the light shimmered across it, radiating understated luxury. Caspian stopped short. For a split second, his breathing stalled. What stopped him wasn't only Iris's transformation. It was the man standing beside her. Adrian Klein. A man who appeared in global financial magazines only as a silhouette or a code name. The current head of the Klein family. Someone who stood at the very peak of the world's wealth pyramid, high enough that even Caspian had to look up. Rumor had it that Adrian kept a low profile, devoted himself to art and history, and that the nonprofit foundations under his name held research materials on more than half of the world's lost ancient civilizations. And now, this legendary figure was gazing at Iris with near-indulgent affection, taking the glass from her hand and replying in smooth French. "You're right, Iris. Your eyes always see the secrets time tries to hide." As he spoke, he naturally reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair from her temple, tucking it behind her ear. The gesture was intimate. The posture was effortless. Iris. Those 2 syllables, spoken by one of the most powerful men in the world, carried an unquestionable sense of belonging. Caspian felt his blood rush backward. Jealousy, shock, and a fear even he couldn't name. They swarmed his heart like ants, gnawing relentlessly. He remembered the rainy night 3 years ago when he had tossed the signed divorce papers in front of her. The Thorne family doesn't need someone who only fiddles with scraps of fabric and thread, he had said then, his voice colder than the rain outside. That ridiculous little craft of yours can't even earn enough to buy yourself a decent outfit. Sign it. Take your so-called treasures and get out of my world. How had she responded? She'd simply looked up. For the first time, there was no light left in those eyes that once held nothing but gentle love. She said nothing. She only picked up the pen and signed her name, stroke by stroke, after the words, Iris Valen. No tears. No drama. Not even a single question. At the time, Caspian had seen that extreme calm as weakness, acceptance of fate. But now, standing here like an uninvited outsider at someone else's celebration, he watched the woman he had discarded without a second thought bloom beside another man, radiant in a way he had never witnessed. And that man possessed a status Caspian might never reach, even if he gave everything he had. A sharp pain rose from his stomach. The fingers gripping his glass turned white. He couldn't accept it. How could this woman... How could she possibly be doing so well after leaving him? He took a deep breath, forcing down the turbulence in his chest, and stepped forward. No matter what, he needed to ask her, face to face. He wanted to tear away that elegant facade, to see whether underneath it she was still the humble, desperate Iris who once needed to survive on his approval. Ms. Iris. Caspian spoke in a deliberately flat tone. His voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to make both of them turn. The smile on Iris's face faded the instant she saw him. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't hatred. It was something far more cutting, indifference. Like spotting an irrelevant stranger on the street, not worth an extra second of attention. She gave a slight nod in acknowledgement. Adrian, on the other hand, studied him with mild curiosity. His blue eyes flickered as he asked in standard Mandarin, "And this gentleman is?" Caspian ignored him, his sharp gaze locked on Iris. "Have we met somewhere before?" He deliberately used the tone of a cheap pickup line laced with mockery and disrespect. He wanted to see her panic. He wanted her past with him to surface, ugly and exposed in front of this new man. At last, Iris looked straight at him. Her eyes were calm, like still water. "Sir," she said slowly, "I believe you've mistaken me for someone else." One sentence. And their 3-year marriage, along with all the love and resentment, was erased completely. Caspian felt his temples throb as a nameless fury surged upward. Just as he was about to snap, Adrian laughed. He stepped forward, subtly placing himself between Iris and Caspian. Extending his hand, he said warmly, "Mr. Lee." "Caspian, I've heard a great deal about you. I'm Adrian. Iris is my chief antiquities consultant and the most precious treasure of my life. You mentioned you've met her before?" His tone was gentle, but the pressure in those blue eyes sent a chill through Caspian. "Chief antiquities consultant? Most precious treasure?" Caspian looked at the victor's smile on Adrian's face, then at Iris behind him, her expression calm and unmoved. Only then did he understand. He had lost. In the 3 years he knew nothing about, what he had personally thrown away was never a worthless stone. It was an uncut, once-in-a-lifetime diamond, and now, that diamond was shining brilliantly in someone else's palm. No, too. The air seemed to solidify into a heavy pane of glass, trapping the 3 of them inside. Every breath carried a sharp, cutting edge. Caspian did not take Adrian's outstretched hand. His gaze slid past Adrian's shoulder, sharp as 2 poison-tipped blades, stabbing straight into Iris. Through clenched teeth, he forced out the words, "Chief Antiquities Consultant? Iris, you've really learned how to play the game." The sarcasm and contempt in his tone were as naked as they had been 3 years ago. This was how he had always asserted his authority, especially in front of the woman who now made him feel completely out of control. Iris's lashes fluttered once. That was all. She didn't even look at him. Instead, she said softly to Adrian, "Adrian, let's go see the Yunmeng Brocade. It's about time." Her voice wasn't loud, but her message was unmistakable. Caspian was nothing more than an obstacle to walk around. Of course. Adrian withdrew his hand from the air without the slightest hint of embarrassment. When he turned back to Iris, the gentleness had already returned to his eyes. He naturally took her hand, the same hand that had once sewn buttons back onto Caspian's shirts countless times, scrubbed tea stains late into the night, now enclosed in another hand, warmer and stronger. Caspian watched as they walked past him. Adrian even gave him a polite nod, as if thanking him for providing a brief bit of entertainment at an otherwise dull cocktail party. From beginning to end, Iris never looked at him again. The sharp pain in his stomach struck once more, fiercer than before. Caspian clenched his fists so tightly that his nails dug into his palms, using pain to suppress the humiliation and rage threatening to burst free. He threw her away? No. She betrayed him. She must have climbed her way up to Adrian through some shady, disgraceful means. A woman who never even finished college, who only knew how to play with needles and thread. How could she possibly become the world's richest man's chief antiquities consultant? It was ridiculous. He had to get to the bottom of this. He would expose her lies and make her reveal her true colors in front of this new elite. Caspian turned and strode after them. At the heart of the reception area, a display platform cordoned off by velvet ropes stood in silence. At its center, inside a climate-controlled glass case, lay an ancient roll of fabric. It was his true target tonight, the Yunmeng Brocade. The silk was a deep indigo blue, as if the entire night sky had been woven into it. Gold thread formed fantastical cloud patterns and mythical beasts. Even after 2,000 years, its former splendor was unmistakable. But time had been cruel. There were multiple areas of damage, and the most severe tear nearly split the entire design in two. This Yunmeng brocade is currently the only surviving silk textile that records the mythological system of the ancient Chu region, a curator explained to the surrounding guests. As you can see, however, the damage is extensive. We've consulted the world's top restoration experts, and all of them were at a loss. The Klein Foundation is exhibiting it this time in the hope of finding a miracle. A wave of regretful sighs rippled through the crowd. Caspian stood at the edge, watching coldly. He knew its commercial and cultural value was beyond measure. If it could be restored, the Thorn Cultural Foundation's reputation would skyrocket. For this, he had already prepared a budget of $300 million. Just then, Adrian led Iris to the display. "What do you think, Iris?" Adrian asked, a trace of anticipation in his voice. Caspian let out a scoff. What could she possibly think? At best, she might recognize it as a piece of cloth. He could already picture her standing there, tongue-tied and embarrassed in the face of such a professional discussion. But Iris simply observed it in silence for a few seconds, then spoke. Her voice was calm and unraised, yet it carried a strange clarity that quieted the murmurs around them. "This isn't ordinary damage," she said. "Look at the edges of these tears. There are trace residues of soap pods and wood ash. That means when it was excavated, looters who didn't know what they were doing washed it using crude methods, destroying the original silk protein structure. Standard protein reinforcement and warp and weft reconstruction won't work." As her words fell, the area went dead silent. Even the curator, who had been speaking nonstop just moments earlier, looked stunned. These details were preliminary conclusions reached only after months of internal research by their expert team and had never been made public. Iris seemed oblivious to the shock around her. Through the glass, her fingers traced the brocade's patterns lightly. In her eyes was a devotion and tenderness Caspian had never seen before, like someone caressing a lover's face. "To restore it," she continued, "we have to reverse the chemical process that caused the damage. That means using bioenzymes extracted from soap pods from a specific growth year, measured precisely down to the microgram, to neutralize the residues and restore minimal activity to the silk fibers. After that, we'd use the lost double-sided brocade grafting stitch to reconnect the broken warp and weft at a molecular level." She paused, then looked up at Adrian, her eyes blazing. "It's extremely difficult. The success rate may be less than 1%. But it's not impossible." In that instant, Caspian felt as though he'd been struck by lightning. Double-sided brocade grafting stitch. He'd heard that term before. 3 years ago. Another rainy night, earlier than the divorce. He'd been overwhelmed by an overseas acquisition deal and didn't get home until late. The study light was still on. When he pushed the door open, he saw Iris wearing a high-powered magnifying headset bent over a tattered piece of embroidery, focused as if performing delicate surgery. He'd flown into a rage and knocked the tools from her hands. "Iris! Look at yourself. My girl stays up in the middle of the night guarding this trash? Tomorrow's my mother's birthday banquet. Are you planning to show up dressed like this? Do you have any idea how people laugh at me behind my back?" Startled, she scrambled to pick up the scattered needles and thread, murmuring, "Don't touch it, Caspian. I'm testing an ancient stitching method called double-sided brocade grafting. I'm almost there." "I don't care about your damn stitching," he'd roared. "This is your last chance. Throw all of this away. Starting tomorrow, learn flower arranging, horseback riding, learn how to be a proper thorn girl. Otherwise, we're done." Looking back now, the way she'd looked at him that night hadn't been fear. It had been despair. So that almost successful technique she spoke of was the very miracle that even the world's top restorers couldn't achieve. And those scraps he dismissed as trash were treasures Adrian now held with reverence. He had been wrong. Painfully, catastrophically wrong. "Well, you certainly sound convincing," an unwelcome voice chimed in. It was Damon, Caspian's domestic rival from Horizon Group. "May I ask which restoration master you trained under, miss?" Clearly, Damon didn't recognize Iris either. To him, she was just a pretty woman trying to catch Mr. Klein's attention. Adrian smiled, about to answer, but Iris spoke first. She turned around, facing the crowd for the first time and finally facing Caspian among them. Her gaze swept calmly over Damon, then settled on Caspian. "I don't have a teacher," she said slowly. "My craft was passed down from my mother and my grandmother. They were the last inheritors of Sioux embroidery. And my name is Iris." With that, she gave Adrian a slight nod, turned, and, under everyone's watchful eyes, walked into the restricted work area behind the display. The curator hurried after her, respectful as a devoted apprentice. In the hall, Caspian stood frozen, blood rushing violently to his head. Iris? Sioux embroidery. How had he forgotten? She had once told him her hometown was Suzhou. Her family descended from an embroidery workshop. He had always thought it was just another common craft from a rivertown background. He had never imagined that the pinnacle of that craft could reach such a staggering height. What he lost to wasn't Adrian's unimaginable wealth. It was Iris's talent, the talent he had personally strangled, only for it to be reborn elsewhere in brilliant fire. 03. The lights of the cocktail reception were still dazzling, but Caspian's world had already dimmed into shadow. An inheritor of Sioux embroidery? "Please, sounds better than a song," Damon from Horizon Group muttered sarcastically nearby, his voice pitched just loud enough for Caspian to hear. "Caspian, don't tell me this is some little songbird you used to keep at home? She looks unfamiliar, doesn't she?" Caspian's expression was dark as still water. He didn't respond. His gaze cut straight through the crowd, fixed on the figure that had just disappeared through the door to the work area. A songbird? A woman Caspian had once kept. Would she really be the kind who needed cheap theatrics to attract attention? What was laughable was that even now, deep down, he was still instinctively defending that pitiful sense of dignity tied to the title everyone once gave her. He turned without a word, pushed through the crowd, and walked out onto the terrace. The cold night wind rushed into his lungs, easing the suffocating pressure in his chest just a little. He pulled out his phone and dialed his assistant. "Look someone up for me. Iris." His voice was hoarse and urgent. "The Iris who divorced me 3 years ago. I want everything, where she's been, who she's met, how she got to know Adrian, all of it. Send it to my email within 30 minutes. He hung up and leaned against the icy railing, staring at the scattered lights shimmering across Lake Tahoe in the distance, his thoughts tangled into a mess. His mind drifted back to the final year of their relationship. He had been consumed by the group's transformation, waking up to financial reports and data every day. When he came home and saw Iris hunched over those moldy old fabrics, the air thick with the scent of herbs he couldn't even name, an inexplicable irritation would swallow him whole. To him, it was wasting time, escaping reality, dead weight that didn't belong in the future blueprint of his business empire. He believed divorcing her, making her leave with nothing, was the best lesson he could give. He was certain that within 3 months, this woman with no ability to survive in society would come back crying, begging him. But he waited 3 years. Not a call, not a message. She vanished, as if she had evaporated from the world. And now, she had reappeared in his life in a way he could never have imagined. In the moment she did, she aimed straight at what he cared about most, the Yunmeng Brocade. Half an hour later, his phone vibrated. The email from his assistant had arrived. Caspian opened it. The glow of the screen reflected off his increasingly grim face. The report was detailed, clearly obtained through unconventional means. At the end of the email was a photograph. In it, Iris wore a white work coat, standing before a wall covered in spools of colorful silk thread. Her face was bare, her hair casually tied back, but her eyes shone like 2 stars. Behind her stood several blonde, blue-eyed Europeans, gazing at her with open admiration as if they were looking up at a deity. Caspian stared at the photo again and again. It felt as if an invisible hand had clenched around his heart, squeezing until he could barely breathe. So she hadn't clung to anyone. She had been looked up to. She hadn't been lucky. She had relied on the very craft he had mocked, climbing step by step out of the mud and back onto solid ground. And what he had thrown away with his own hands was truly a queen. The email mentioned something called the Phoenix Project. He had heard of it. It was the Klein Foundation's most mysterious and heavily funded initiative in recent years, aimed at reconstructing and reviving the civilization of the ancient Silk Road. Anyone capable of leading that project, their professional standing spoke for itself. Chief Antiquities Consultant wasn't a job title at all. It was a coronation. Adrian wasn't her patron. He was her discoverer, her ally, someone who truly understood her. That realization crushed Caspian more than learning she stood beside the world's richest man. Money, Caspian had that. Maybe not as much as Klein, but he believed that given time, he could compete. What he didn't have was the vision to recognize Iris's worth, the depth to resonate with her soul. He had lost completely. Just then, the terrace door opened and Adrian stepped out. He had changed out of his formal attire, now wearing a casual cashmere sweater. The sharp edge of a business titan had softened, replaced by the refined calm of a scholar. Mr. Caspian, enjoying the breeze alone? Adrian walked over and offered him a cigar. Caspian didn't take it. He looked at him coldly. What do you want, Mr. Klein? Adrian didn't mind. He lit the cigar himself, took a slow draw, and exhaled. Smoke curled between them, blurring their expressions. I wouldn't dare say I want anything, Adrian said evenly. I'm just here to thank you. Thank me? Caspian frowned. He couldn't imagine what he had done to deserve gratitude from someone like this. Yes, Adrian smiled faintly. Thank you for giving Iris back to the world 3 years ago. If she had remained a bird in your cage, the world might have lost an artist capable of turning time backward, and I would have missed the most important person in my life. Every word was like a surgeon's scalpel, slicing open the wound Caspian most refused to acknowledge, then rubbing salt into it. This was boasting. This was provocation. This was a verdict. Caspian snapped his head up, suppressed fury burning in his eyes. You think you've won? Winning and losing, that's a merchant's way of thinking. Adrian flicked the ash from his cigar, his blue eyes deep in the night. For Iris and me, we're simply doing what we believe matters. Like bringing the Yunmeng Brocade back to life. The Yunmeng Brocade is something the Thorn Group will get, no matter what, Caspian said through clenched teeth, his final card. Oh? Adrian raised an eyebrow. As far as I know, the ownership currently belongs to my foundation. We don't seem to have any intention of selling. You put it on display to look for partners and funding, didn't you? Caspian sneered. Thorn can provide the best resources. $300 million. If that's not enough, 500. As long as it can be restored. Mr. Caspian, you still don't understand. Adrian shook his head, a trace of pity crossing his face. What can restore it isn't money or resources. It's a person, and that person just happens to be by my side. He paused, stubbed out the cigar, and turned to leave. At the doorway, he stopped, looked back at Caspian, and added, "Oh, one more thing. Iris has already drafted a preliminary restoration plan. The entire process will take at least a year and a half. And she's made it clear, during restoration, the Yunmeng Brocade cannot leave her studio. So," Adrian smiled, a smile that was almost cruel. "This treasure will be traveling back with us to Lyon tomorrow morning. I'm afraid, Mr. Caspian, you've made the trip for nothing." 04. Caspian's world collapsed completely the moment Adrian finished that sentence. A wasted trip? No, this was far more than just a wasted trip. It meant that the core project he had carefully planned, meant to elevate the Thorn Group's cultural influence, had failed before it even began. More importantly, this failure was orchestrated entirely by Iris, presented right in front of him in a way he couldn't interfere with, couldn't buy off, and couldn't overpower with money or status. He stood frozen on the terrace like a stone statue until his assistant cautiously approached and whispered, "Caspian, the reception is about to end. We should leave." Only then did Caspian snap back to reality. He turned mechanically and walked through the still bustling crowd. The clinking glasses and easy laughter now looked like a massive farce to him. He didn't go looking for Iris again. He knew that anything he said or did now would only make him look more pathetic. On the way back to the hotel, Caspian remained silent. The glittering nightscape of Geneva rushed past the car windows, retreating rapidly, just like his utterly humiliating day. The driver glanced at his boss's storm-dark expression in the rearview mirror and didn't dare make a sound. Back in the presidential suite, Caspian yanked off his tie and dropped heavily onto the sofa. He closed his eyes, but his mind betrayed him, replaying two images over and over. One was from 3 years ago. Iris, in faded old clothes, crouched on the floor, carefully picking up the needles, thread, and embroidery pieces he had knocked over, her eyes dull and lifeless. The other was from just hours ago. Iris, in a pale moon-colored cheepaw, standing under the spotlight, calm and confident as she spoke of technical concepts he couldn't even understand, her eyes burning with light. Where had everything gone wrong? He had always believed he gave her the best life. He moved her into one of Manhattan's most exclusive residences, handed her a black card with no spending limit, made sure she never had to worry about money. He thought this was love. This was the ultimate gift a successful man could give. All he asked in return was that she give up those undignified hobbies and behave quietly and obediently like an elegant ornament. Was that really so hard? To countless women desperate to marry into wealth, this would have been paradise. But Iris, she didn't want it. His phone vibrated again. A follow-up message from his assistant. Caspian sat bolt upright. His heart clenched violently. He remembered now. It had happened. At the time, he thought, what's there to see about a dying old woman? Deals worth tens of billions. That was what mattered. Boom. His mind went blank, a loud ringing filling his ears. Her grandmother passed away with regrets unresolved. The family home was forcibly demolished. And behind all of it, there had been Caspian's shadow. He had always believed he asked for the breakup simply because she was going nowhere. He had never realized that before that he had already crushed her last remaining roots in this world with the cold logic of business. He remembered it now, the day they divorced. After signing her name, she stood up to leave. At the door, she turned back and asked him softly, just one question. Caspian, if one day the thing you treasure most were destroyed by someone else like it was trash, what would you do? How had he answered? He seemed to remember giving a light laugh and saying, in my world, nothing is irreplaceable. How arrogant. How cruel. Only now did he finally understand what that question had meant. What he destroyed wasn't just fabric. It was her grandmother's final wish, the legacy built by generations of her family. The very root of her identity as an inheritor of Sioux embroidery, and he hadn't even known. Caspian covered his face in agony, his knuckles cracking under the force of his grip. So that breakup hadn't been a one-sided abandonment. It had been her silent, decisive revenge. She hadn't cried or argued. She had calmly severed all ties with him and then spent 3 years remaking herself into someone he could no longer reach. Caspian? His assistant's uneasy voice came through the phone. These details. Keep digging. Caspian lowered his hands. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice rough as sandpaper. Find out exactly what Adrian sees in Iris. I don't believe it's just her craftsmanship. He couldn't accept total defeat. He would rather believe there were other dealings behind this, other chips he didn't know about, things that could still be measured in Li. As long as there were chips, there was still room to negotiate. Yes, Caspian. After hanging up, Caspian walked to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the lights of Geneva shimmered like a galaxy, yet not a single one was lit for him. He thought of the way Iris had looked at the Yunmeng Brocade at the reception, that tenderness, that obsession. She looked at that lifeless artifact with 10,000 times more affection than she ever looked at him, a living man. And suddenly, a far more terrifying truth hit him. In Iris's world, he might never have truly existed at all. Caspian, along with his prized wealth and status, may have been nothing more than an irrelevant swamp she accidentally stepped into on her path toward art, and she had already pulled herself out. No. He refused to accept that. A flash of ruthlessness crossed Caspian's eyes. He still had a chance. The Yunmeng Brocade was a national treasure. Its ownership and restoration rights weren't something only the Klein Foundation and Iris could decide. There were federal cultural authorities involved, national-level strategies. He was going back to the States. He would mobilize every resource the Thorn Group had, step in from a higher level. He would make Iris understand that this world ultimately still ran on power and capital. Even if she had risen like a phoenix, she wouldn't escape his grasp so easily. He immediately pulled out his phone and booked the earliest flight home. He had to move before Iris and Adrian to set a net so tight there'd be no escape. What he wanted wasn't just the Yunmeng Brocade. What he wanted was that woman, standing before him again, lowering her proud head. This time, he would make her understand who the real one in control was. 05. Early the next morning, Caspian boarded his private jet back home. The roar of the engines cut him off from the outside world, yet did nothing to calm the storm raging inside him. He hadn't slept all night, his eyes bloodshot, his mind running through every move ahead, over and over again. He had to win. This was no longer just a business dispute. It had escalated into a matter of a man's pride. As soon as the plane landed at Capital International Airport, Caspian didn't go home. He got straight into a car and headed for the National Administration of Cultural Heritage. Thanks to Thorn Group's massive donations over the years to cultural preservation and his own deep connections across political and business circles, he was quickly ushered in to meet a director in charge of overseas recovered relics. Director Ward, I apologize for dropping in unannounced, Caspian said, deliberately keeping a low profile, his tone earnest. But this is a matter of great importance. Director Ward adjusted his glasses and smiled politely. You're too kind, Caspian. Thorn Group has always been a steadfast supporter of our work. Please go ahead. It's about the Han Dynasty Yunmeng Brocade. Caspian got straight to the point. I heard it resurfaced in Switzerland and that the Klein Foundation intends to restore it. Oh? Director Ward's expression turned serious. Your information is impressive. That's correct. We only received confirmation last night. This Yunmeng Brocade is a national treasure we've been pursuing for years. Its reappearance is tremendous news. Good news, but with hidden risks, Caspian said gravely. As far as I know, the Klein Foundation has entrusted the entire restoration to a woman named Iris, and they plan to take the brocade to Lyon, France for the work. He fixed his gaze on Director Ward, carefully watching every flicker of expression. A national treasure leaving the country carries enormous risk, and this Iris, while she has some reputation overseas, is still young, running a one-person studio. Entrusting something of this magnitude to her alone, if anything were to go wrong, the consequences would be unimaginable. He deliberately omitted his personal history with Iris, presenting himself as nothing more than a patriotic entrepreneur concerned for national interests. Director Ward frowned. Your concerns aren't unfounded. We've been urgently discussing this as well. Ideally, of course, the relic should be restored domestically. Exactly, Caspian said, smoothly offering his solution. I respectfully request that the administration initiate official-level negotiations with the Klein Foundation. The Thorn Cultural Foundation is willing to cover all costs. We can assemble a joint project team with the nation's top restoration experts and carry out the work here at home. We have the best equipment, the safest environment. There will be absolutely no risk to the relic. He was cutting in from underneath the table, using state power to pull the rug out completely, to kick Iris and Adrian out of the game in one stroke. Once Yunmeng Brocade returned to China, onto his turf, Iris would have no choice but to come to him if she wanted access to it. And then, the initiative would be back in his hands. Director Ward considered this for a moment, then nodded. Your proposal is highly constructive and reflects Thorn Group's sense of national responsibility. We'll immediately activate diplomatic channels to express our serious concerns to the Swiss side and the Klein Foundation. With Thorn Group backing us, we'll have far greater leverage. A massive weight lifted from Caspian's chest. He knew it. This was done. In the face of national interests, no matter how wealthy Adrian was, he would have to give way. Walking out of the administration building, the Beijing afternoon sun was blinding. Caspian narrowed his eyes, the corner of his mouth curling into a cold smile. Iris, Adrian, you look invincible together? Then let's see if you can withstand the power of a nation. Over the next 2 days, Caspian mobilized every PR and legal resource Thorn Group had, working in tandem with the administration to launch a swift, hard-hitting return of a national treasure campaign. Official communiques. Diplomatic pressure. Media momentum. A full combo strike and public opinion ignited overnight. Hashtag overseas lost national treasure Yunmeng Brocade may return. Hashtag patriotic entrepreneur Caspian spends millions to bring relic home. Hashtag independent restorer or national team who eyes truly qualified. 9. Online, countless netizens, unaware of the full story, were fired up by patriotic fervor. They condemned the Klein Foundation, questioned Iris's competence, and demanded that Yunmeng Brocade come home. Caspian watched it all coldly. This was exactly the effect he wanted. He intended to roast Iris over the flames of public opinion, turning her from a mythic Eastern enchantress into an ambitious individual trying to monopolize a national treasure. On the afternoon of the third day, Director Ward called him. Caspian, good news. Ward sounded excited. The Klein Foundation has backed down. They've agreed to return Yunmeng Brocade to China for restoration, but they've set one condition. What condition? Caspian's heart tightened. They insist that the restoration be fully led by Mrs. Iris. Domestic experts may assist, but the final restoration plan and all technical decisions must follow Ms. Su's direction. Caspian froze. What was this? He'd pulled the rug out, only halfway. And Director Ward continued, Mr. Klein specifically stated that while Thorn Group may serve as the project's financial sponsor, you personally must not interfere in any technical decisions during the restoration. Caspian could practically see Adrian's calm, effortless expression as he said it. Had he won? He'd forced Yunmeng Brocade back to China. Or had he lost? Not only had he failed to push Iris out, he'd personally built her an even higher, broader stage, elevating her from an overseas oddity to the chief director of a national-level project. And Caspian, after all his scheming, had ended up as nothing more than the guy paying the bill. It was a humiliation beyond words. Caspian, are you still there? Ward asked. Yes. Caspian forced the word out through clenched teeth. I agree. He had no choice. The arrow was already on the string. Backing out now would mean losing everything and leaving a reputation for bad faith at the official level. He could only move forward. At least Iris was coming back onto his turf. As long as she was in the country, he had countless ways to make things inconvenient for her, until she had no choice but to bow her head. After hanging up, Caspian slammed his fist into the heavy desk. The solid rosewood surface let out a dull thud. A week later, at Capital International Airport, a Gulfstream G650 from Geneva touched down slowly on the runway. Caspian stood beside the VIP channel on the tarmac, flanked by officials from the administration and the country's top restoration experts. Dressed in a black overcoat, his expression cold and severe, he looked like a man awaiting a long-delayed verdict. The cabin door opened. Iris appeared. She had changed out of her chippo, now wearing a sharp beige trench coat. Her long hair was tied back in a ponytail, her face bare of makeup, yet she looked even more striking than she had at the gala. Behind her were security personnel carrying a temperature-controlled case, their expression solemn. Further back, Adrian did not appear. A flicker of grim satisfaction crossed Caspian's mind. It seemed that even the world's richest man had to step aside in the face of state power. Iris descended the stairs, her calm gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd without lingering on any face, including Caspian's. She walked straight up to Director Ward and gave a slight nod. "Director Ward, I'm Iris. I've brought Yunmeng Brocade back." Her voice was cool, composed, neither humble nor defiant, more like someone fulfilling a sacred duty than submitting to scrutiny. Caspian watched her. This woman who felt both familiar and utterly strange. He realized that his carefully orchestrated, high-profile power play had had absolutely no effect on her. She was like a stone dropped into the deep sea, no ripples, no waves. He stepped forward, blocking her path. "Ms. Iris," he said quietly, lowering his voice so only the two of them could hear, "welcome home." Iris finally looked at him. There was no hatred in her eyes, no resentment. Only a bottomless calm and a trace of pity. "Mr. or Miss Caspian," she said softly, each word clear, "I think you've misunderstood. I'm not coming home. I'm just here to take back what belongs to me." What belonged to her? Before Caspian could fully process the meaning of that sentence, Iris had already walked past him toward the eagerly waiting experts. What did she mean? A terrifying thought flashed through Caspian's mind. He spun around, staring hard at Iris's retreating figure. Could it be that this time her true objective had never been Yunmeng Brocade at all? Then, what was it? 06. At the Palace Museum, in the Department of Conservation Science, inside a restoration lab specially cleared for the Yunmeng Brocade project, the most advanced constant temperature, constant humidity facility in the country. On the massive work table, the brocade that carried 2,000 years of history had been carefully unrolled. Under the shadowless lights, the torn fissures and faded colors looked like ugly scars, jarring to the eye. Iris, dressed in a white anti-static lab suit, gloves and mask on, held a high-powered magnifying glass, inspecting the silk inch by inch. Around her stood a group of the nation's most authoritative textile restoration experts, their average age well over 60. These were men and women who ruled their respective fields, whose words normally carried absolute authority, yet now they stood there like elementary school students, barely daring to breathe as they watched this woman who was far too young. "Arthur," Iris said, setting down the magnifying glass. Her voice came from behind the mask, calm and precise. "Please measure the pH level of Zone 3, accurate to 3 decimal places. Professor Eleanor, I need the full microscopic composition analysis of all the gold threads, especially the trace elements, and prepare Group A Petri dishes immediately. Use the soapberry enzyme stock solution I brought, dilute it at a ratio of 1/5000. We need to observe its activation effect on fibroin." One instruction after another, clear, methodical, flawlessly logical. Those complex technical terms and meticulous experimental procedures flowed from her mouth as naturally as breathing. The experts she addressed responded without hesitation, turning at once to their tasks. The way they looked at Iris had shifted, from scrutiny and doubt to pure admiration. On the very first day, Iris had conquered these masters completely, with the depth of her expertise alone. Outside the lab, separated by thick, bulletproof glass, Caspian watched it all in silence. He had been standing there for 3 full hours. As the project's largest investor, he had the right to enter the observation area. But this was as close as he could get. The alloy door leading into the restoration lab stood like an unbridgeable chasm, completely isolating his world from Iris's. He watched her issue commands inside, watched those senior experts, people who normally expected even him to show deference, follow her orders without question. He felt like a ridiculous clown. He had painstakingly built this grand stage, only to realize that he wasn't even qualified to step onto it. All he could do was stand below, looking up at the heroine he had once discarded without a second thought, now radiant beyond reach. "Caspian, would you like some water?" his assistant asked cautiously. Caspian didn't respond. His gaze was locked on Iris. She truly didn't care about him at all. From the moment she stepped off the plane until now, she hadn't spoken to him once, hadn't spared him a single extra glance, as if Caspian and the massive thorn group behind him were nothing more than an optional backdrop in this project. That complete disregard hurt more than any furious argument or overt revenge ever could. He remembered what Iris had said at the airport. "I'm just here to take back what belongs to me." What was she taking back? The Sioux family's legacy? The dignity he had trampled on? Or something else? The more Caspian thought about it, the more restless he became. He couldn't keep waiting like this. He had to do something, anything, to break this suffocating stalemate. He turned to his assistant. "Go. Bring Marcus." Marcus, the project manager from Hongtu Real Estate, who had overseen the forced demolition of the Sioux family's ancestral home 3 years ago. Half an hour later, a sweating, middle-aged man stood trembling in front of Caspian. "See, Caspian." Caspian looked him up and down, his gaze cold enough to kill. "Marcus, that embroidery workshop project in Suzhou 3 years ago. Do you remember it?" Marcus's face went deathly pale. "Caspian, that was all in the past." "I asked if you remember it." Caspian snapped. I do, Marcus shuddered. "I heard that back then, in order to meet the deadline, you used some methods?" Caspian asked slowly, each word like a hammer striking Marcus's heart. "Caspian, I did it for the company's interests. The compensation negotiations stalled. The schedule was tight. I don't want your excuses," Caspian cut him off. "I just want to know, what did you take from that old house?" A suspicion had suddenly taken shape in his mind, one so chilling that even he felt his pulse spike. If Iris's roots were there, then besides the house itself and her memories, there had to be something more tangible. Marcus's eyes darted away. He stammered, "Nothing really, just some broken furniture and a pile of old cloth." "Old cloth?" Caspian's pupils constricted sharply. "Yeah, some unfinished embroidery pieces and some yellowed booklets. They looked like sketches, maybe. We treated them as construction waste." Marcus's voice grew smaller with each word. "Treated them?" Caspian's voice turned glacial. "Where did you put them?" They're stacked in the company's old warehouse out in the suburbs." "Caspian, those things really aren't worth anything." "The address." Caspian nearly roared. The moment he had it, he wasted not a second, driving straight there. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Beijing had been neglected for years. The iron gate was rusted through. As he pushed it open, the stench of long-sealed mold rushed out. Caspian ignored it, charging inside. Following Marcus's description, he found several dust-covered wooden crates in a corner. Hands trembling, he pried one open. Inside were stacks of embroidery pieces wrapped in oil paper and several thread-bound booklets. He picked up the top one, blew the dust away, and 3 elegant characters appeared before his eyes. The Sioux Family Embroidery Manual. He flipped it open. Inside were exquisite hand-drawn patterns, accompanied by dense notes in tiny calligraphy detailing stitch techniques, color matching, silk preparation secrets. On one page, a divine beast motif from Yunmeng Brocade was drawn in full detail. Beside it were 4 characters. Double-sided continuation weave. Caspian's mind went blank, as if struck by a sledgehammer. This was it. This was what Iris had come back for. This was the Sioux family's root, the distilled essence of centuries of Sioux embroidery tradition. And this treasure, enough to drive any restorer mad with obsession, had spent 3 years tossed in a forgotten corner like trash. He thought of Iris's grandmother's final wish. Of the question Iris had once asked him. If the thing you cherish most were destroyed like garbage, how would you feel? Now he had his answer. He would go mad. Caspian clutched the manual as if it were a red-hot brand searing his hands. At last he understood Iris's true purpose. Restoring Yunmeng Brocade was her mission and also her bait. She knew that once the brocade returned to China, Caspian would intervene. Once Caspian intervened, he would investigate the past. Once he investigated, he would find this place and this manual. She was forcing him to dig up his own sins with his own hands. Forcing him to confront just how foolish and arrogant he had been. This was the real killing blow, not to the body but to the heart. Caspian staggered out of the warehouse, dazed. The sunlight fell on him, yet carried no warmth. What should he do? Return the manual to her? Beg for her forgiveness? No. A flash of madness crossed his eyes. He couldn't just hand over his only leverage. This manual was now the sole thread that could reconnect him to Iris. He would use it to trade for what he wanted. He would make her understand, no matter how perfectly she had planned everything, the rules were still set by him, Caspian. Back in the car, he took out his phone and dialed Iris's number. For the first time in 3 years, he reached out to her of his own accord. The phone rang for a long time. Just as he thought she wouldn't answer, Iris's cool voice came through. "Hello." "It's me," Caspian said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "I found some of your things. In the old warehouse from your ancestral home." Silence on the other end. He could hear it clearly. The subtle hitch in her once even breathing. The first crack of emotion he'd seen from her all day. He had won back a sliver of control. "The Sioux family embroidery manual," Caspian said slowly, word by word. "It's with me. Tomorrow at noon. Jingxin Tea House, south side of the city. I'll be waiting. Come alone." He didn't give her a chance to respond. He hung up. 07. The next day, south of the city, Jingxin Tea House. It was one of Caspian's private properties, secluded and impeccably discreet. He arrived an hour early, sitting in a private room on the second floor by the window. The tea in front of him had already been replaced twice. He was restless, repeatedly running his fingers over the Huanghuali wooden box beside him. Inside it lay the Sioux family embroidery manual. His final trump card. His only lifeline. He didn't know how Iris would appear, angry, emotional, or still wearing that same impenetrable calm. He had rehearsed countless opening lines, countless negotiation strategies. He would trade the manual for a chance, just one chance, for her to look at him again. He could apologize. He could compensate her. He could even hand over the entire Hongtu real estate company and let her deal personally with everyone who had ever hurt her, as long as she would turn back and look at him once. Just before noon, the private room door was gently pushed open. Iris walked in. She wasn't wearing work clothes or a qipao, just simple black trousers and a white silk blouse, her long hair falling loosely over her shoulders. No makeup. Yet her cool, restrained aura was impossible to hide. She was calmer than Caspian had imagined. She sat down across from him, her gaze landing directly on the wooden box. "Where is it?" Her voice carried no emotion at all. Caspian's heart sank. She couldn't even be bothered with a single unnecessary word, straight to the point. It made him feel like a desperate peddler trying to sell his wares, while she was the buyer who held absolute control over the price. Suppressing his discomfort, he slid the box toward her. "The manual is here, completely intact." Iris reached out and opened the box. When she saw the familiar booklet, its cover faintly yellowed with age, her fingers paused for just a moment. Caspian caught it. He knew then, this meant even more to her than he had realized. Iris didn't take the manual immediately. Instead, She looked up at him. This was the first time since returning to China that she had looked at him so seriously for so long. Her eyes were complicated. Sorrow, irony, and something Caspian couldn't quite read, exhaustion. Caspian, she said slowly, you're treating it as a bargaining chip, aren't you? His Adam's apple bobbed. He didn't deny it. Iris, I know I was wrong before. You weren't wrong. Iris cut him off. Her voice was soft, yet utterly final. You were just always this kind of person. In your world, everything can be measured. Everything can be traded. Feelings, marriage, dignity. And now, it's my grandmother's last keepsake. Each sentence was like a gentle blade, precisely piercing Caspian's most fragile places. You think holding it lets you negotiate with me? She continued. To make me forgive you? Or just to make yourself feel better? The corner of her lips lifted into an almost non-existent curve. It wasn't a smile. It was desolation in its purest form. You haven't changed at all. Not one bit in 3 years. Caspian felt his face burning. All his schemes and calculations were completely transparent in front of her. He tried to argue, but found himself at a loss for words. You don't need to explain. Iris shifted her gaze back to the manual and spoke quietly. Finding it is the only thing you did right, because it never belonged with trash. She reached out, took the manual from the box, and gently brushed her fingers over the cover, like greeting a long-lost family member. Watching her, a flicker of hope rose in Caspian's chest. She cared this much. That meant there was still a chance. Iris, he softened his tone, a trace of pleading slipping into his voice. I know it's too late for anything I say, but give me a chance to make it up to you. What do you want? Shares in Hung Yuan Group? That plot of land in the West District? Or do you want Marcus to disappear from this world? Just say the word. I'll make it up to me? Iris looked up at him as if she'd heard the greatest joke in the world. Caspian, do you really think money and power can erase everything? She stood up and carefully placed the manual into her handbag. What you destroyed was my grandmother's dying wish. My way home. What are you going to use to compensate for that? There is nothing you can compensate, Iris said, her eyes turning razor sharp in an instant. You're sitting here today negotiating with me, not because you're clever, but because I wanted you to find it. I wanted you to see with your own eyes what you casually threw away back then. I wanted you to understand that you and I were never from the same world. With that, she turned to leave. Stop. Caspian shot to his feet and grabbed her wrist. It was so slender, it felt like it might snap with a single twist, her skin icy cold. Iris. His voice trembled with emotion. Do you really have to do this to me? 3 years of marriage. Does it mean nothing to you? She didn't struggle. She simply turned back and looked at him. The last trace of emotion in her eyes vanished, leaving behind a hollow, dead-water stillness. Mean something? She asked softly. Caspian, do you remember what day our wedding anniversary was? He froze. Do you remember what I liked to eat? What I was afraid of? Caspian opened his mouth, but no words came out. You don't, Iris answered for him. You only remember your financial reports, your stock prices, and what you thought a Mrs. Thorne should look like. Our marriage was nothing more than an insignificant ornament in your vast business empire. Now that ornament is gone, and you're simply not used to it. That isn't love, Caspian. It's possession. She dissected his pitiful self-deceived devotion with the precision of a forensic examiner, leaving nothing intact. Caspian felt his strength draining away, bit by bit. His grip on her wrist loosened. Now I have the manual, Iris said, pulling her hand free and stepping back, completely distancing herself from him. I'll continue restoring Yunmeng Brocade. That's my promise to the country, and my duty to my ancestors. It has nothing to do with you. As for us, she paused, then smiled, a real, relieved smile at last. This is the end, Mr. Regorded. Caspian Thorne, I wish you and your empire eternal glory. She didn't look back even once as she walked out of the private room. Caspian stood there alone, frozen. Sunlight filtered through the bamboo blinds, casting mottled shadows over him, flickering and dim, just like his heart. He had lost. Completely. What he thought was his trump card had only been one step in her plan. What he thought was deep love had been nothing but a ridiculous sense of ownership. He had pushed her away with his own hands. Now she would never come back. Just then, his phone rang. Adrian. Caspian stared at the name for a long moment before finally answering. Mr. Caspian. Adrian's voice was as gentle as ever, with an edge barely perceptible. I hear you found Iris's family embroidery manual? Caspian's heart sank. So she told you already? No. She didn't, Adrian chuckled softly. I did. I told her where the manual was most likely to be. Caspian felt as if he'd been struck by lightning. How did you know? Because 3 years ago, the company that acquired the Su family's ancestral home, Hongtu Real Estate, was also one of my acquisition targets, before I bought it. Adrian's tone was light, almost casual, yet filled with absolute control. My people uncovered everything earlier than your assistant did. I simply didn't tell you. I chose to let Iris come back herself and let you discover it on your own, because I knew. Only when you tore open your own wound would you truly feel pain. Caspian, your biggest flaw isn't arrogance. It's stupidity. You only ever see immediately. You never see people's hearts. I, on the other hand, do. Now the game is over. Good luck. The call ended. Caspian stood alone in the empty private room, phone in hand. For the first time, he felt a cold and fear that seeped all the way into his bones. He hadn't lost to Iris. He hadn't lost to Adrian. He had lost to the man he was 3 years ago. 08. Leaving the tea house, Caspian moved like a puppet with its strings cut, climbing into the car on pure instinct. When the driver asked where to go, he stared blankly out the window. After a long while, he rasped out 2 words. The office? Other than work, he no longer knew where else he could go. Back in the empty top-floor executive office, Caspian shut himself inside. He didn't turn on the lights, letting the dying glow of dusk flood the room in a lifeless wash of gold. He had lost. That realization was like a monster, gnawing madly at his insides. He had lost to Adrian's long game. That man had known everything from the very beginning, yet never made a move, like a master chess player watching his opponent charge around the board, smug and self-satisfied, only to reveal at the end that every single step had been calculated. And he had lost even more thoroughly to Iris's decisiveness. She hadn't even bothered with revenge. She had simply reclaimed what was hers in the calmest possible way, then turned and walked away, as if he were nothing more than a loose stone she'd kicked aside on her journey through life. Everything he once prided himself on, his wealth, his power, his intellect, had become a joke in their presence. The shrill ring of the internal phone shattered the silence. It was his chief secretary. Caspian, something's wrong. Her voice carried barely suppressed panic. We just got word from Europe. The semiconductor company we've been bidding on, Syntech, has just been fully acquired by a VC firm under the Klein Group. Caspian's fist clenched hard. Syntech was a cornerstone of the Thorn Group's 5-year strategic plan, critical to whether they could secure a foothold in the AI sector. He had spent nearly a year preparing for this, pouring in tens of billions. When did it happen? His voice was unnervingly calm. About half an hour ago. Their move was incredibly fast. Practically overnight, they secured over 60% of the shares. We didn't even have time to react. Half an hour ago, exactly when Adrian had hung up on him. This wasn't business competition. This was naked retaliation. A fatal follow-up strike, delivered at the moment he was already bleeding the most. And there's more. The secretary's voice grew even heavier. Several real estate projects we acquired through Hongtu Properties have also been exposed for regulatory violations. The authorities have already launched investigations. Our stock price is in freefall. Caspian leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. When a wall collapses, everyone pushes. Adrian didn't even need to get his hands dirty. All it took was a light shove, and the countless enemies Caspian had made in the business world swarmed in like sharks scenting blood. The empire he had so carefully built was cracking at a speed visible to the naked eye. Caspian suddenly laughed. The sound was hoarse, filled with self-mockery and despair. He had wanted to use capital and power to force Iris to bow her head. Instead, the man standing behind her had used the very methods Caspian was most proud of to utterly destroy him. This was the strength of a true apex predator. Remain still and nothing happens. Make a move, and the earth shatters. He picked up his phone, almost unconsciously opening Iris's social media account. It was one his assistant had tracked down, an account she almost never updated, with only a handful of photos. One showed the view outside a studio in Lyon, sunlight warm and bright. Another showed a restored burgundy tapestry, its colors vivid and rich. The most recent one had been posted just today at noon. The photo wasn't of the Yunmeng Brocade nor the Su family embroidery manual. It was a bowl of plain Yangchun noodles. The broth was clear, scallions bright green, a golden fried egg resting on top. In the background were the upturned eaves of a watchtower at the Forbidden City. The caption was just one short line. Caspian's eyes reddened without warning, he remembered. 1 year on his birthday, he'd come home drunk in the middle of the night after entertaining clients. Iris hadn't gone to bed. She was waiting in the kitchen. She made him a bowl of Yangchun noodles, exactly like the one on the screen now. What had he done back then? He'd pushed it away in disgust and said, "Who eats this kind of thing?" No taste at all. He hadn't even noticed her eyes quietly turning red after he turned away. So it hadn't been just a bowl of noodles. It was the most precious kind of tenderness she knew how to give. It was love, taught to her by her grandmother, carrying the flavor of her hometown, and he had poured that love straight into the trash with his own hands. The phone slipped from his limp fingers and fell onto the carpet, the screen still lit. That steaming bowl of noodles looked like a massive, merciless joke. At last, he understood what he had truly lost. Not a woman who could be measured in money. Not an accessory that could be replaced. What he lost was someone who had once made him her entire world. Someone willing to wash her hands and cook for him. Willing to share every small joy in life with him. What he lost was his way home. 1 month later, the restoration of the Yunmeng Brocade entered its most critical phase, reweaving. Under Iris's leadership, everything progressed smoothly and methodically. Using the secret techniques recorded in the Su family embroidery manual, combined with modern technology, she created an entirely new restoration method that stunned the cultural heritage community. She became the undisputed queen of the field. Meanwhile, the Thorn Group spent that same month teetering on the brink. Its stock price plunged, projects stalled, executives resigned. Caspian was run ragged, fighting with everything he had just to keep the group from collapsing entirely. He grew gaunt at an alarming pace. The sharpness and arrogance in his eyes replaced by a fatigue so heavy it seemed impossible to dispel. He never went back to the Forbidden City. He never disturbed Iris again. He knew he no longer had the right. Only occasionally, late at night, would he silently check her social media. She never updated it again. That night, after dealing with yet another mess, he left the office building well past midnight. A black Bentley sat quietly by the curb. The window rolled down, revealing Adrian's handsome, composed face. "Mr. Caspian," he said calmly. "Do you have time for a chat?" Caspian gave a self-deprecating smile. "Mr. Klein here to enjoy my downfall?" "No." Adrian shook his head. "I'm here to give you a choice." He handed over a document. "This is an acquisition agreement for all of the Thorn Group's distressed assets. I'm offering this price." He tapped the figure on the page. "I'll take all your problems off your hands. The only condition is that you leave China and never appear in front of Iris again." Caspian stared at the number. It was enough to keep him comfortable for the rest of his life, but compared to his former glory, it was nothing. This was the final, merciful exile. "And if I refuse?" Caspian asked hoarsely. "Then the Thorn Group will disappear from the map within a month," Adrian replied, still gentle, yet utterly resolute. "And you'll be left with nothing, buried in debt." Caspian fell silent. He knew Adrian was telling the truth. He glanced into the car and saw a thermal container on the front passenger seat, the same kind Iris used to carry her Yangchun noodles. So Adrian wasn't here to mock him after all. He was simply here to pick up the woman he loved after work. And, incidentally, to deal with an eyesore. An overwhelming exhaustion washed over Caspian. This war, he had never stood a chance from the very beginning. "I agree," he heard himself say. The moment the words left his mouth, all the strength drained from his body. Adrian nodded, unsurprised by the outcome. He took back the document, rolled up the window, and the black Bentley glided soundlessly into the night, heading toward the Forbidden City. Caspian stood alone on the empty street, watching the car vanish from sight. He knew that the man inside was going to meet his queen, and he, the dethroned king, didn't even have the right to say goodbye. 09. The plane cut through the clouds as Caspian leaned against the window, watching the land below break into smaller and smaller fragments. He was leaving the place where he had lived for more than 30 years, heading toward a foreign country to begin a lifetime of exile. He had accepted Adrian's terms, not out of fear, but because he was truly exhausted. For the past month, he had fought with everything he had to save his crumbling empire, only to realize that it was all in vain. Adrian's strikes were precise and lethal, like a perfectly executed surgical operation, severing every vital artery the Thorn Group depended on to survive. He was like a drowning man. No matter how fiercely he struggled, all he could do was watch himself sink deeper and deeper. Giving up became his only option, and the most dignified one. He sold all his shares in the Thorn Group, dismissed the team that had followed him for years, and liquidated every property and luxury car under his name. Overnight, the business emperor who once stood above the clouds became an ordinary man with nothing but a string of numbers in a bank account. Before leaving, he made one last trip to the Forbidden City. He didn't go inside. At dusk, after closing hours, he stood outside the Gate of Divine Might, gazing across the towering red walls at a world he could no longer touch. He knew that on the other side of those walls, Iris was doing the work she loved. By her side were kindred spirits and a lover who admired her, cherished her. Her life had entered an entirely new orbit, brilliant and radiant. And on that trajectory, there was no longer any place for him. He stood there for a long time, until night fully enveloped the ancient palace, before finally turning away. No goodbye. No attempt to hold on. Between them, everything ended, cleanly, completely, with a final full stop. 1 year later, Provence, France. Beside a vast sea of purple lavender stood an old stone manor. Among Adrian's many properties, it was the most unassuming, and his favorite. The manor's backyard had been converted into a modern restoration studio. Sunlight streamed through the enormous glass dome, illuminating the roll of fabric on the work table, now completely renewed. The Yunmeng Brocade. After more than a year of restoration, it had finally regained the splendor it once held 2,000 years ago. The broken silk threads had been seamlessly rejoined. The dulled hues had returned to a deep, majestic sapphire blue. The divine beasts embroidered in gold thread shimmered in the light, as if they might leap from the brocade at any moment. It was no longer a damaged relic. It was a living work of art. Iris removed her magnifying glasses and let out a long breath. A smile of pure release spread across her face. "It's finished," she said softly. Behind her, Adrian stepped forward and gently wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin atop her head. "I knew you could do it," he said, his voice full of pride and love. "It's so beautiful," Iris said, leaning back into his embrace. "So beautiful it doesn't feel real." "Just like you," Adrian said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Over the past year, they had been almost inseparable. Once the restoration was complete, Adrian brought her here. He pushed aside all business, spending his days with her, watching the sun rise and set, walking through fields of lavender, studying the ancient textiles he had collected from around the world. Here, she was no longer the famous Oriental witch of the restoration world, and he was no longer the billionaire who commanded global capital. They were simply Adrian and Iris, a pair of ordinary lovers immersed in art and love. Iris changed, little by little. The cool detachment she once carried was replaced by a warmth and softness that came from deep within. She laughed more. She joked with him. On sunny afternoons, she would nap in his arms. She was healing. In a few days, it'll be the global unveiling, Adrian said. The whole world will see your masterpiece. Iris nodded, though her expression turned thoughtful. Adrian, I was thinking, you want to leave it in China, don't you? Adrian said, as if reading her mind. She looked at him in surprise. Adrian smiled, brushing a hand through her hair. I've already taken care of it for you. It will be donated by the Klein Foundation as a permanent gift to China and housed in the Palace Museum. That's where it belongs. Iris's eyes grew moist. This man always saw straight through her thoughts and quietly arranged everything for her in advance. What he gave her wasn't just love, it was respect and understanding. Thank you, Adrian. Silly, Adrian said, tapping her nose. I'd do anything for you. He paused, then took a velvet box from his pocket. In the fragrant air and radiant sunlight, he dropped to one knee and opened it. Inside was a ring of elegant, minimalist design, inlaid with tiny pieces of ancient turquoise. Miss Iris, he looked up at her, blue eyes filled with starlight. I don't have an empire like Mr. Caspian once did, but I'm willing to build for you an art kingdom that belongs to you alone, one that will never fade. Will you marry me? Iris looked at him, smiling through her tears. She nodded hard. 3 days later, the global unveiling of the Yunmeng Brocade was held at the Louvre in Paris. The event captivated the entire world. Members of royal families, political leaders, and the world's top artists and collectors gathered in one place. When the red cloth covering the Yunmeng brocade was lifted, the room filled with sharp intakes of breath, followed by thunderous applause. Everyone was awed by this miracle from the East. As the lead restorer, Iris stood at the center of the stage beside Adrian, receiving praise from across the globe. She wore a deep blue gown personally designed by Adrian, inspired by the Yunmeng brocade itself, elegant, confident, regal, like a true queen. At that very moment, in a quiet neighborhood of Paris, inside a small Chinese restaurant, Caspian sat alone in a corner, watching the live broadcast on the television mounted on the wall. He was thinner than he had been a year ago. Quieter, too. He ran this small restaurant himself. It wasn't big, and business was just average. He learned to buy groceries, to cook, to wash dishes. He learned how to make yangchun noodles. Over and over again, he tried to recreate the flavor he remembered, the one Iris once made for him. He never succeeded. Not once. On the screen, a reporter handed the microphone to Iris and asked what the greatest secret was behind restoring a national treasure that had once been considered beyond saving. Holding the microphone, Iris fell silent for a moment, then looked into the camera and said slowly, "There is no secret. It's simply giving everything you have, every ounce of love and reverence, to something that deserves to be loved and revered. Because once you lose it, you may never be able to find it again." Caspian stared at the radiant woman on the screen, every word striking his heart like a crushing grip. He knew those words were meant for him. This was her final judgment, and the cruelest one of all. He lowered his head and looked at the bowl of yangchun noodles in front of him, the one that never quite tasted right. At last, tears slid down his face in silence. He had lost it. And this time, he truly would never find it again. 10. After the press conference, Adrian and Iris didn't stay in Paris for long. They politely declined all media interviews and dinner invitations and returned to the Provence manor overnight. To them, applause and acclaim meant far less than the quiet of the flower fields. A few days later, an unexpected package arrived at the manor from China. There was no sender's information on it, only a blurry postmark from a small city Iris had never even heard of. Who could have sent this? Iris asked, puzzled. We'll know once we open it, Adrian said, slicing the packaging open with a small knife. Inside was an ordinary-looking wooden box, old-fashioned, worn, carrying a faint scent of camphor wood. Iris opened the box. The moment she saw what was inside, she froze. Lying quietly within was a stack of cotton handkerchiefs, washed until the fabric had faded pale. In the corner of each one, a tiny orchid had been embroidered using the simplest stitches. The needlework was dense and careful, showing great patience, but the technique was clearly clumsy, immature. These were the pieces she had used to practice when she first began learning embroidery. She remembered them clearly. Back then, not long after she and Caspian got married, they had moved into that luxurious villa. She had nothing to do all day. Caspian disliked her touching rags and loose threads, so she practiced in secret, cutting up his old discarded shirts into small handkerchiefs and working on the most basic stitches in her room. Once she finished one, she carefully put it away, storing it in an old wooden box he would never notice. Later, when they divorced, she left in a hurry, taking only the professional tools and materials her mother and grandmother had left her. These little things, filled with a young girl's unspoken feelings and humble love, had been left behind with that marriage, forgotten in the past. So how had they ended up here? Iris picked up one handkerchief. Her fingertips felt the familiar roughness of the cotton. Beneath the handkerchiefs lay a folded sheet of letter paper. The paper had yellowed with age, and the handwriting on it was unmistakable. Caspian's. Bold, forceful strokes, brimming with energy. Yet this letter carried a messiness she had never seen before, and a sense of panic. There was no date at the end. Holding the letter, Iris's fingers trembled slightly. She didn't know when Caspian had written it. Was it after he had lost everything, when he was preparing to leave China? He had left this box behind. The butler said you wanted it thrown away. I told him to keep it. A tear slid from Iris's eye without warning, dropping onto the yellowed paper and blooming into a small ink stain. She had always believed that in that marriage, she was the only one who gave, the only one who loved. She thought Caspian had felt nothing but calculation and disdain toward her. But it turned out that in some unseen corner, he too had once felt a fleeting hesitation, a trace of reluctance, even if he himself never fully realized it. It was just that this reluctance was too faint, too insignificant. In the end, it was crushed beneath his towering ambition and arrogance. What's wrong? Adrian came over, and when he saw her tears, he pulled her into his arms with concern. Iris said nothing, only handed him the letter. After reading it, Adrian fell silent for a long time. He's a pitiable man. In his own way, he sighed. Yes, Iris said softly against his chest, her voice catching. Pitiable and hateful. She put the handkerchiefs and the letter back into the box and closed the lid. That past, along with that man, needed to be sealed away for good. It had brought her endless pain. And in the end, it had also shaped who she was today. But her future had nothing to do with him anymore. Adrian, Iris looked up at him through tear-filled eyes. Can we have the wedding sooner? Adrian blinked, then broke into a brilliant smile. He bent down and kissed her deeply. As you wish, my future Mrs. Klein. 3 years later. Milan, backstage at a top-tier fashion brand's launch show. A tall man in a black suit was calmly directing the staff with practiced ease. He wore thin, gold-rimmed glasses, his hair neatly combed. Though he spoke fluent Italian, traces of Eastern features could still be seen in his brows and eyes. At first glance, he looked like nothing more than an ordinary show director. Mr. L. Everything is ready. The models can go on, an assistant reported. The man known as Mr. L nodded, his gaze shifting toward the runway entrance. The lights came up. The music started. The first model stepped out, wearing a breathtaking gown that fused traditional Sioux embroidery with Western three-dimensional tailoring. The exquisite embroidery ignited the entire venue instantly. Oh my God, this is Sioux embroidery! It's C's work. Sioux. C finally launched haute couture. The fashion critics and buyers went wild. Sioux. C, the luxury brand founded jointly by Iris and Adrian, had risen to the pinnacle of the fashion world in just 3 years, defined by its singular Eastern aesthetic and uncompromising craftsmanship. Backstage, the man watched the runway through a monitor. Behind his lenses, his gaze was calm and deep, betraying no emotion. Mr. L, the show is a huge success, the assistant said excitedly. Madam is at the front. She says she'd like you to join her for the final walk. The man hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. No. Tell Madam I still have some closing work to handle. Congratulations to her. The assistant left, disappointed. Alone amid the backstage noise, the man watched the screen as Iris, wearing an elegant white gown, walked onto the runway beside Adrian, receiving cheers and applause from all over the world. She smiled, radiant and genuinely happy. The man watched quietly. After a long while, a faint relieved smile touched his lips. He turned away, removed his glasses, and slipped them into his pocket. Then, silently, he disappeared into the shadows backstage. Mountains high, rivers long, each finding their own peace. Perhaps this was the best possible ending.